She walked into the rain and never walked out. Welcome to Fogged Clue. I am your host, Marin. It's a gift to share these stories with you. Tell me where you're watching from. Your comments make this journey real. Let's go. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It came in slow sheets, sometimes thinning to a mist that licked the windows of Quai des Orfèvres like a cat's tongue, sometimes falling heavier, tapping like small, patient fingers on the panes. The Seine had risen by 1/2 meter, sluggish and brown, dragging twigs and sodden leaves past the embankments, as if Paris were being gently swept clean without anyone noticing. Maigret stood in the corridor near his office window, with a cigarette that had gone cold between his fingers. He didn't light another. The building was quieter than usual. Inspector Janvier was out chasing a man who had lifted 30 francs from a tobacconist's till. Lucas had gone home early. His wife was nursing a toothache, and he was soft that way. Maigret should have gone home too. Madame Maigret had made blanquette de veau for dinner, and she would be waiting with a little concern, but no reproach. He had told her he would try to come early, but something had kept him at his desk long past the last phone call, long past the bustle of the afternoon shifting into the hush of evening. It was not a case that held him, not yet. It was the sense, faint and not yet shaped into thought, that something had passed close to him, something he should have caught. He moved to his desk and sat heavily. Outside, beyond the wet glass, he could see the lights of the Préfecture reflected on the water like yellow smudges. He reached for the folder he'd placed aside before lunch, a thin one, barely a case. A missing person, nothing urgent. A girl from a pension in the 14th arrondissement, a small street off Rue Daguerre. 22 years old, kept to herself. Left one morning in a grey coat and did not return. That had been 5 days ago. The report had come in late. The patron of the pension had waited 2 days before informing anyone. It was only when the girl's employer, a bookseller near Denfert-Rochereau, had asked after her that the police had been notified. Even then, it had gone first to the local post. Routine. A young woman vanishes in Paris every week. Elopement, a secret abortion, a whim. They usually reappear, quietly, sometimes shamefaced, sometimes bruised. Maigret ran his finger down the page. Her name, Claire Vionnet. No criminal record, no history of disturbance. Parents dead, a cousin in Limoges, no lover mentioned. The landlady had described her as pale, well-mannered, quiet. A thin description. He turned the page over, twice, as if something might be hidden in the folds. Then he set it down, stood, and reached for his coat. It was not a matter for him, not really. The Brigade Criminelle did not chase after absent-minded girls or wayward hearts. But there was something in the tone of the report that had troubled him. A sentence in the landlady's account. She always left the room very clean. Not odd in itself, but oddly placed, as if the cleanliness were a kind of message or an ending. He left Quai des Orfèvres without telling anyone. The concierge was sweeping near the steps, her scarf damp and clinging to her neck. She didn't speak as he passed. The rain had turned the pavement to mirror. Headlights slid across the street like ghosts. He did not take a taxi. By the time he reached Rue Daguerre, his shoulders were damp beneath the collar of his coat. It was the sort of street Maigret knew intimately. Small shops half closed, green grocers stacking crates, a butcher wiping down the windows. The smells of meat and rain and tired vegetables blended with the faint whiff of gas from old stoves. The pension was in a narrow building squeezed between a creperie and a shuttered bookstore. The entrance was recessed, with 2 potted plants that had not survived the season. A buzzer had been installed, but did not work. Maigret knocked with the side of his fist, not impatiently. After a moment, a woman opened the door, 50-ish, dry, with a cardigan pulled tightly over her chest, and a pinched mouth that had formed too many disapproving shapes. "I'm not accepting new boarders," she said. "I'm not looking for a room," Maigret replied. He gave her his card without explanation. She squinted at it, then stood aside. The interior smelled of boiled water and old varnish. A long hallway stretched back with closed doors on either side. The wallpaper had once been floral, now browned at the edges. She led him to a small parlour, nodded toward a chair, and perched on the edge of another as if it might bite. "I've already spoken to the police," she said. "I know," Maigret said. He waited. "She left on Monday. Quietly. She always left quietly." "Did she say where she was going?" "She never did." Maigret studied the woman's face. There was something resentful in it. Not about the girl, but about the questions, the disruption. "Do you miss her?" She blinked. "It's not a matter of... She was a good tenant, that's all." Maigret nodded. He didn't ask more. After a moment he said, "May I see the room?" She led him up a narrow staircase, the third door on the left. She opened it with a key, then stood aside. The room was small but neat. A narrow bed with a wool blanket, a wooden desk with a lamp, a single window looking down onto a wet courtyard. No perfume in the air. No sense of life having been interrupted. Only a faint orderliness, like someone had tidied just enough to disappear. There was no suitcase missing, no drawer ajar. But on the desk sat a worn paperback, spine cracked. The pages were splayed open to a dog-eared corner. Madame Bovary. Maigret didn't touch it. When he looked back at the landlady, she said, "She never brought anyone up. I would have heard." Maigret nodded. "Thank you." He didn't press her. He knew already she would say the same things again if asked, that she had noticed nothing, heard nothing, remembered nothing. And perhaps it was true. Or perhaps she simply preferred the story of a quiet girl who vanished to the more complicated one of a girl whose pain had become invisible in such a quiet room. Back in the street, the rain had softened to a mist again. Maigret lit a fresh pipe and stood under the awning of the creperie, watching the windows above the pension. He did not feel urgency. He felt something else. A waiting, a tension, the same as before a storm changes direction. Not fear, not guilt, just something that had shifted in the silence. He stayed there a long time before walking away, the glow of his pipe dim behind the curtain of rain. The streets had darkened further by the time Maigret reached the small café opposite d'Enfer Rochereau. He did not go inside at first. He stood under the awning, the sleeve of his coat slowly absorbing the mist, and watched the steady shuffle of Parisians passing with their collars turned up, the hush of wet tires on slick stone. Inside the café, yellow light pooled around wooden tables. A man with a moustache read a newspaper with fingers stained from tobacco and ink. Two women spoke in low voices over thick cups of coffee. It was ordinary, subdued, forgettable, and therefore exactly the kind of place Maigret found useful. He entered without ceremony. The smell of coffee, wet wool, and old smoke met him like a familiar coat. He didn't remove his hat. He took a table near the window and ordered nothing, only nodded to the waiter, who hesitated, and then moved on without question. From there, he could see the entrance of the small bookshop across the street, Librairie du Lac, its windows curtained against the night. This was where Claire Vionnet had worked. Part-time, the report had said, 3 days a week, mostly afternoons. Maigret had telephoned earlier and spoken to the owner, who sounded tired and suspicious, reluctant to say anything over the wire. Maigret had simply said he might pass by. He waited 10 minutes, finishing the dregs of a coffee someone else had abandoned on the next table. At length, he crossed the street, the bell above the bookshop door jangling with the sort of timidity that belonged to shops already half expecting to close forever. A man stood behind the counter, thin, hollow-chested, wearing a cardigan buttoned all the way to his throat. His glasses were smudged, and he blinked at Maigret as if measuring him. "You're the one who called," he said. "About Claire." Maigret nodded. He showed no identification. It was not needed. "She's not come back," the man said, already defensive, already weary of repeating the fact. "If that's why you're here." "I'm not here to accuse anyone," Maigret said. "Only to understand." "May I?" The man gestured faintly toward the back of the shop. They moved past low shelves, some dusty, some meticulously ordered. The smell of old paper and damp glue lingered like a memory of forgotten letters. There was no one else in the shop. "She worked there," the man said, pointing to a low desk near the rear, a small counter with a stool, a ledger, a pencil pot. She liked sorting the new titles. Wasn't much use with customers. "Shy?" Maigret asked. "Not shy. Distant. Not cold. Just far away. Like someone who was used to not being noticed." Maigret turned, studying the man. "You noticed?" "I notice everyone," the man said without pride. "Booksellers do." There was silence between them, the kind Maigret preferred, where people revealed themselves not to fill space, but to manage discomfort. "She was different from the others," the man went on, almost reluctant. "Never late, never flustered, but she never spoke of herself. Not once. I only found out about her cousin in Limoges because a letter arrived one day, and she left it open by mistake. Did she seem frightened of anything? Number, but I sometimes felt she was waiting for something." "For what?" The man shook his head. "If I knew, I might have said something before." "Did anyone ever come here to see her?" "Only once," he said, and now his tone changed slightly. He moved behind the counter and pulled out a small book, thumbed through it, then stopped. "About 3 weeks ago, a man came in, didn't buy anything, didn't even browse, just stood at the window until she noticed him, then left. She turned pale when she saw him, said nothing. I asked if it was someone she knew. She said, 'No, not any more.' Then she went back to arranging the stock." Maigret took a moment. "Can you describe him?" "I can try. Not young, not old. Maybe late 30s. Brown coat. Tall, but hunched a little, like someone used to being looked down on. Red scarf. That I remember." "Did he speak to her?" "Not a word. He only looked." "And since then?" "Never returned. But she changed after that. She stayed later, even when I told her to go. She triple-checked the locks. She started smoking outside during breaks, though I never saw her carry cigarettes." Maigret nodded. "She left no message for you?" "Nothing. Just didn't show up one day. I called the pension. The landlady said she hadn't come back the night before. I waited another day, then filed the notice. I didn't think it would matter. I thought she would return quietly, the way she always left." Maigret placed a heavy hand on the edge of the counter, not to steady himself, but to feel the worn grain of the wood, to place himself in her rhythm. A quiet girl, a glance through glass, a man who didn't speak. Outside, the rain began to fall again, not heavy but certain. He left the shop without making a scene, without taking the man's name. It would be in the file, and it didn't matter yet. Outside, he did not light his pipe. The rain had picked up too much. He simply stood for a moment, thinking. Then he walked, not in search of anything immediate, but to feel the area around her life. Rue Daguerre, Rue Boulard, the quieter offshoots that led nowhere and connected nothing. His feet moved without question. 2 blocks south, he passed a small laundrette with steamed windows and an elderly woman asleep in a chair behind the counter. She was surrounded by half-folded towels and the warm hum of machines. It had nothing to do with the girl, and yet it felt part of the same world. Places where women disappeared slowly in silence, in steam, in folded shirts. The walk led him to a square, almost deserted save for a few children's swings creaking slightly in the wind. There was a bench beneath a chestnut tree. Maigret sat. He did not yet have a theory. He barely had a pattern. But in his coat pocket, the name Claire Vionnet sat heavier than most cases he'd handled recently, not because of its mystery, but because of its simplicity. She was not missing in the usual sense. She had not been plucked or hunted. She had perhaps withdrawn, like someone slipping below the surface of a quiet pond. What lingered most was the phrase the bookseller had quoted. No, not anymore. There was a story there, short or long, but buried. She had recognized the man. She had not feared him like a stranger, nor greeted him like a friend. She had merely turned pale and continued working. Maigret stayed until the rain crept beneath his collar. Then he rose and walked toward the metro. He would visit the cousin in Limoges next, or at least call, but not tonight. Tonight he would go home. Madame Maigret would still have the veal. She always did. And in the morning he would begin again, not with the files, with the faces, with the shoes left too clean, with the silence that hung not in absence, but in the deliberate choice to remain unseen. The next morning the rain had not ceased, but it had softened into something like breath, a constant exhalation from the sky that coated the city in a quiet sheen. Maigret left his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir later than usual. Madame Maigret had insisted he eat properly. He had obliged, though his mind remained elsewhere, retracing the girl's steps not in logic, but in rhythm. The time she rose, the streets she walked, the moments that had meant something only to her. He did not return immediately to Quai des Orfèvres. Instead, he took the metro south, changing lines with the practiced ease of someone not rushing. His destination was a municipal office on Rue Foy de Vaux, the kind of place where lives were reduced to stamped papers, slanted handwriting, and files that smelled faintly of mildew. He wanted her records, birth, guardianship, and any relocation forms she might have submitted. It was tedious work, but Maigret had learned that paper had its own voice, cold, factual, but sometimes more honest than people. The clerk, a thin man with a habitual cough and eyes that avoided questions, took 10 minutes to produce the documents. Maigret said little, only grunted as he accepted the file and sat at a long chipped table under a flickering bulb. The contents were sparse. Claire Vionnet, born in Lyon, orphaned at 13, mother, tubercular death, father, cause unspecified, likely drink, no siblings, one relocation to Paris at 17, marked as temporary domestic employment. Then a transfer of address 4 years later, the pension on Rue Boulard. There was a single emergency contact, Marguerite Gendron, cousin, Limoges. No phone number, only a street address in neat, sloping cursive. Maigret jotted it into his notebook. He studied the folder a while longer, noting that Claire had changed employment 3 times in 5 years, all within a few blocks of each other. Nothing suspicious, yet something incomplete, as if she had existed on the edge of the city's awareness, careful never to leave more than a trace. He returned to the street and lit his pipe beneath a narrow awning. The smoke curled thickly in the damp air. Across the way, an elderly woman in a navy coat tugged a small dog across the intersection. A delivery boy shouted as his bicycle slid. Everything around him was ordinary, yet within the quiet layers of that morning, between the offices and shop fronts and sodden leaves, there hovered a question no one else seemed to ask. Why had Claire erased herself so gently? By mid-afternoon, Maigret was seated at his desk at the quay, staring again at the photograph that had been added to the file. It had arrived that morning from the local commissariat. A passport photo, slightly out of focus, perhaps a few years old. Claire Vionnet looked into the lens not with fear, but with something closer to indifference, as if she had learned that being observed meant nothing unless someone was truly willing to see. The face was plain, but not forgettable. It carried a suggestion of grief without complaint, of detachment that was not unkind. Maigret found himself tracing the outline of her hair with his eyes, the small curl at one temple. She had not expected the photo to matter. Lucas entered quietly and placed a note on the corner of the desk. "From Limoges," he said. "Telephone call just returned." Maigret picked it up. The handwriting was Janvier's. He read slowly. The cousin, Marguerite Gendron, had spoken briefly. She had not seen Claire in over a year. They had written occasionally, short letters, little content. Claire never asked for money, never visited. She was kind, but closed, the cousin had said. I always thought she had secrets, but I never asked. She didn't like pity. There was a pause in Maigret's mind, as if the cousin's words echoed the bookseller's too precisely. A pattern, forming, not from facts, but from silences. Claire Vionnet had been constructing distance her entire life, not from any specific danger, perhaps, simply because nearness had proven fragile. He pushed back from the desk and stood. Lucas looked up. "Coming out?" Maigret asked. "Where to?" "The laundry." Lucas blinked. "Laundry?" Maigret gave him a half-smile and reached for his coat. "Where people vanish into steam. I saw it last night." They walked. Rain tapped gently on the brim of Maigret's hat. The laundrette was still there, of course, and still nearly empty. The elderly woman at the counter sat awake now, sorting through a basket of mixed clothing. Her glasses were fogged. She looked up when they entered, unsure whether to offer a greeting. Maigret showed his card. "Did you know a young woman named Claire Vionnet? Small, quiet, grey coat. She may have come here." The woman squinted. "Could be. A few girls come here after work, always alone. Do you recall if she came recently?" She shrugged. "Not this week, but 2, maybe 3 weeks ago. Someone left a coat. Pale grey. No name inside. Still have it." She shuffled to a rail near the back, rummaged through hangers, then lifted a damp-looking garment. Maigret took it carefully. It was wool, unremarkable. No perfume, no identifying marks, save a small tear beneath the left pocket, clumsily mended. He touched the thread, dark against the light fabric, a detail so small it might have gone unnoticed. But to Maigret, it was a signature. "She came here," he said quietly, more to himself than to Lucas. "She left it." The woman shrugged again. "Could have, or someone else. I don't ask questions." Maigret looked around. The laundrette was simple. 2 long banks of machines, a folding table, a corner with plastic chairs. But in its stillness, he felt something. Not significance, not quite, but presence. "She met someone here," he said after a pause. "Or waited for someone. That's why she left the coat. She didn't want to carry it when she left." Lucas frowned. "Left for where?" Maigret tapped the coat. "For wherever he was taking her. The man from the bookstore." "You think she went willingly?" Maigret didn't answer. He was staring now at the wall clock, listening not to the tick, but to the gap between ticks. There was a kind of rhythm that told him something about her movements. Controlled, voluntary, but prepared. She had chosen the moment. Back on the street, they passed a bakery where the scent of warm bread mixed with wet pavement. Children were laughing somewhere out of sight. Maigret walked slowly, pipe unlit, his coat heavier with each step. She was planning something, he said, but it wasn't escape. Lucas kept pace beside him. Then what? Maigret's face was unreadable. Surrender, perhaps, but not out of fear, out of resignation. They returned to the office in silence. On his desk, the folder lay open once more. Claire Vionnet, a girl who had vanished without force, without noise. And yet, Maigret knew with a quiet certainty that she had not disappeared. She had chosen, in some way, to cease being found. The next step would not come from files. It would come from someone breaking the rhythm, someone who had not expected anyone to notice that she had been missing at all. The following morning, the sky was dull with the weight of another long rain. But Maigret noticed something had changed in the air. It was not clarity. Paris was never clear in November. but the beginning of a pattern forming beneath the surface. A man had glanced through a bookshop window. A girl had vanished without alarm. A coat had been left behind in a laundrette, as though she were making herself lighter before being taken, or simply before leaving. Maigret arrived at the office early. The porter was still sweeping near the courtyard, muttering about broken drains. Upstairs, the corridor smelled faintly of polish and stale tobacco. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot Janvier had forgotten to empty the day before, then closed the door to his office and took out the photograph again. Claire Vionnet stared up at him, still impassive. Not quite pretty, not quite plain. A face without the kind of tragedy that draws attention, but with enough restraint to carry something quietly unbearable. He sat down and began going over every small interaction recorded in her file. There were no phone calls from public booths, no letters posted from her pension, no complaints from neighbors. She had left no footprints in the usual places. It was deliberate, not clever, just clean. He turned to the bookshop again in his thoughts. The man with the red scarf. Not a stranger, but no longer someone she claimed. A man who looked at her once through the glass and left. Perhaps that was the moment she decided. Perhaps it had taken weeks to prepare herself. Maigret stood and reached for his coat. This time, he walked to the local commissariat in the 14th arrondissement. There was no pressing reason to go, no new lead or alert, but he needed to speak to the man who had taken the initial missing persons report. He wanted to hear how it had been said. Sometimes the tone of a voice told more than the words in the report. The precinct was modest, low-ceilinged, and smelled of old ink and damp shoes. He asked for Inspector Delage, and after a short wait, a young man with uncertain posture and ink-stained fingers appeared from the corridor. Maigret recognized him at once, not for his work, but for his type. Precise, conscientious, not yet old enough to be indifferent. "Inspector Maigret," Delage said, startled into standing straighter. "I won't take long." They sat in a small office with a dripping radiator and a typewriter that had lost its ribbon. Maigret asked gently, "You filed the Vionnet report?" Delage nodded. "Yes, she'd already been missing 3 days. Who came to you first?" "The bookseller, a Monsieur Legal, said she hadn't turned up for work. Then we contacted the landlady. She confirmed the girl hadn't returned to the pension." "What was your impression?" Delage hesitated, choosing his words. It didn't feel urgent. The landlady was unconcerned. The bookseller seemed more frustrated than worried. He said she'd been distant. "And you?" Delage glanced at the folder in front of him. "I filed it. Nothing to suggest violence or disappearance under duress. But something stayed with you." The young man's eyes lifted, a little surprised. "She reminded me of someone I once knew, that's all." "Who?" "My sister, before she left home." Maigret let the silence stretch. "Did she come back?" Delage looked down. "No." Maigret stood, nodded once in thanks, and left the commissariat without another word. Back on the street, he paused at the corner, lit his pipe, and watched the people moving past with umbrellas and wet collars. It was not sentiment he was chasing, it was recognition. People like Claire did not vanish out of madness or passion. They evaporated through habit, through practiced absence, but they left traces, even if only in memory. He returned to the bookshop. Monsieur Legal was sorting a stack of second-hand paperbacks near the back. He looked up, more tired than before. "She's not come back," he said, before Maigret could speak. "I know, but I'd like to ask about the man again, the one with the scarf." Legal set down the books, his knuckles pale from pressing the spines too hard. "I told you what I saw. Sometimes the shape of memory changes when it's repeated." The bookseller sighed and sat. "I remember his coat was too large, not in style, in meaning, as though it had once fit him, but no longer did. And his shoes were polished, but his hands were red. like a man who once belonged to something respectable, but no longer could afford the mask. Did she see him before he saw her? I think so. Did she flinch? Number. But she exhaled, one long breath. Then she moved the books again, as if to hide the tremor in her fingers. And you said nothing? What was there to say? Maigret studied him for a long moment. Did you love her? Legal stiffened. She was young. That's not an answer. I didn't know her well enough to love her. That's not what I asked. The man's eyes dropped to the floor. She wasn't meant for here. She handled the books like someone hoping to find a message between the lines. She was searching, but for something that had already passed. Maigret didn't reply. He left a moment later, walking slowly back toward the pension on Rue Boulard, where the landlady sat behind her glass door with a cup of milky tea. She opened it a fraction when she saw him. I told you I don't know anything else. Have you rented the room? Not yet. May I see it again? She hesitated, then gave him the key. The room hadn't changed. It wouldn't. The bed remained made, the lamp unplugged. The window had collected a mist of rain. But something was different. Not in the room, but in Maigret's sense of it. He crossed to the small desk, opened the single drawer, and found what he had missed before, a folded newspaper clipping tucked beneath the lining paper. He unfolded it. The date was from 7 months prior. A small notice, the kind easily overlooked. Man found dead in Canal Saint-Martin. Identity unknown, believed to be vagrant. No photograph. No follow-up. Maigret stared at it for a long time. Then he placed it in his pocket and returned the key to the landlady without a word. That night he sat alone at a corner table of a quiet cafe near Gare du Nord, nursing a beer he barely tasted. He read the clipping again under the yellow light, rereading the same 4 lines. Something about the man, unnamed, unnoticed, had mattered to her. Enough to keep, enough to make her disappear. He did not yet know who the man was, or why his death had marked the beginning of her vanishing. But he was no longer chasing the absence of a girl. He was following the memory of a grief that had not been shared. And someone with red hands and a coat too large, might know the rest. The café near Gare du Nord had emptied by the time Maigret pushed his chair back. The waiter had stopped glancing toward his table long ago, sensing that the inspector would stay as long as the rain did. Outside, the street lamps made pale, sluggish halos in the mist. Paris was not sleeping. Paris never slept. But the mood of the city had shifted into something quieter, more patient, as though waiting for a question that would not be asked aloud. Maigret did not take a taxi. He walked. The clipping in his coat pocket had gained weight in the hours since he found it. Man found dead in Canal Saint-Martin. Identity unknown. She had clipped it, folded it precisely, and hidden it in the drawer as though it were sacred or shameful, or both. Why keep it? And why keep it so hidden, unless it was not meant to be found? At Quai des Orfèvres, he entered without greeting the night porter. He poured himself half a cup of tepid coffee and sat at his desk, spreading the clipping before him. No photograph, no name, but something about the phrasing, believed to be vagrant, felt too easy. There were hundreds of such men, lost in the city's damp corners, no one to claim them. But this one had belonged to someone. Claire Viennet had not torn out pages. She had not kept trinkets. She had chosen this one article, and Maigret felt certain that this man had been the last thread to her old life. Possibly family, possibly something else. He reached into his drawer and took out the telephone directory, leafing through the alphabetical listings of the Paris morgues and administrative archives. It was nearly midnight when he dialed the number of the registry that handled unidentified bodies. A tired man answered with a gruff, "Allô?" "This is Maigret, Brigade Criminelle. I need the file on an unidentified man pulled from the Canal Saint-Martin. 7 months ago. The body was found near Rue Dieu. There should be a note in the log. There was a long silence, some rustling of papers, and the quiet ticking of Maigret's wall clock filled the pause. May 18th, the voice said finally. Male, estimated late 40s. Caucasian, no identification, no signs of trauma. Cause of death undetermined. Drowning presumed. No request for autopsy. No next of kin. Body buried in communal grave. Maigret rubbed the corner of his eye. Was there a description of clothing? Dark wool trousers, canvas workman's jacket, shirt frayed at the cuffs. No shoes. Maigret's voice dropped. Was anything found in the pockets? Button, key without a tag, and a fragment of newspaper. Nothing else. He wrote it down carefully. Thank you. He hung up, sat still for a long moment, and listened to the radiator knocking faintly under the window. A man, unnamed, with nothing in his pockets but a key and a bit of newsprint. Yet someone had loved him enough to keep the record of his death, not publicly, not loudly, but tucked into the bottom of a drawer, as one might press a photograph against the chest on sleepless nights. The next morning, Maigret arrived early. He hadn't slept well, but that didn't matter. Lucas was already there, leafing through forms half-heartedly. I need you to trace the burial record for an unidentified man, Maigret said. May 18th, Canal Saint-Martin. He was buried in a communal plot. We need the site. Lucas raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He had worked with Maigret long enough to sense when questions should be deferred. By noon, the answer came. Père Lachaise, unmarked, in a plot reserved for indigents. Maigret thanked Lucas and put on his coat again. The cemetery was quiet in the grey light, damp with old rain. The gravel underfoot crunched softly. A groundskeeper led him to the section, then retreated without speaking. The plot was plain, anonymous, no marker, no name, just a patch of grass too damp to kneel on. Maigret stood a long time, not out of sentiment. That would come later, if at all. What he waited for was the shape of a question. Who had he been? What had he meant to Claire? Why this slow unravelling, not of crime, but of presence? He returned to the pension once more that afternoon. The landlady opened the door a crack, less irritated now, more wary. She had begun to realize that this matter would not go away neatly. She's still not back, she said preemptively. I didn't expect her to be. Then why? Do you remember any visitors? Someone who came more than once? A man? She frowned. No one ever came up, I told you. But... She trailed off. Maigret waited. There was someone who waited outside a few times. I saw him from the window. He never buzzed, just stood across the street, sometimes for an hour, then left. When was this? Earlier this year. Around Easter, I think. Did Claire see him? I don't know. She never said. He left her again with a polite nod, then walked back to the laundrette. The elderly woman was folding towels in slow, rhythmic movements. She looked up without surprise. You again, she said. That girl must have meant something. She did. I told you everything I knew. Did she ever leave anything else? The woman sighed, gestured toward a cabinet behind the counter. You want to look? Be my guest. He opened the drawer and began sorting through forgotten scarves, gloves missing their partners, socks no one had come to claim. Toward the back, he found a paperback, water-damaged, spine cracked. He opened it. Inside, written in small, cramped pencil, 38 Rue des Solitaires. He used to live here. Maigret closed the book slowly. He left the laundrette without speaking, clutching the book under his arm. Rue des Solitaires was not far, a quiet stretch in the 19th arrondissement, the kind of street where names disappear and buildings forget who they once housed. He arrived at the address half an hour later. The building was narrow, peeling, with no concierge. He pressed the bell, more out of formality than expectation. No one answered. An old man emerged from a door nearby with a bag of groceries. Maigret stopped him gently. "Do you know who lived here?" The man shrugged. "Lots of people. Specifically number 38, ground floor. A man in his 40s. Might have left in spring." The man thought for a moment. "Tall fellow? Limped slightly?" "Perhaps." "He was evicted. Couldn't pay rent. Used to work at the slaughterhouse before it closed. After that, nothing. I heard he drank. Seemed polite, though. Never loud. Do you remember his name?" "Number." "He kept to himself. But he had a visitor once. A girl. Very quiet. Came only once." Maigret's breath slowed. "When?" "Just after the New Year. She left something for him. A bag, I think. He cried when she left." The man continued on without another word. Maigret stood before the door a while longer. The book pressed to his chest now felt heavier than it should. Claire had come here once. She had seen the man. Perhaps she had not known then that he would vanish into the canal months later. Perhaps she had. But the visit had been farewell. The next step, Maigret knew, would not be found in files or doorbells. It would come only by waiting, in silence, like the man once did across from her window. Someone still remembered her. Someone who had not expected her to remember him back. And that someone, Maigret thought, might have already returned. The apartment on Rue des Solitaires had yielded no more than a nameless void, the memory of a man whose presence had evaporated like moisture in the cracks of old plaster, leaving behind only damp shadows and the faint suggestion of weeping. Yet Maigret walked away not frustrated, but quieter, his mind beginning to thread the needle between the girl's last steps and the man's slow erasure. She had known him. She had once cared enough to leave him a bag. Then she had watched him vanish. Not all at once. That kind of disappearance never worked with people like her. No, she had watched over time, perhaps helplessly, as he slipped under the city's surface until the Canal Saint-Martin took what remained. Back at Quai des Orfèvres, the office was beginning to stir with the uneasy rhythm of a Wednesday afternoon. Files changed hands without urgency. Conversations hummed just under the threshold of meaning. Maigret hung his coat, brushed the rain from his hat, and moved slowly to his desk. He set the paperback from the laundrette beside the folder. The inscription still sat beneath the warped cover like a secret half whispered to no one. 38 Rue des Solitaires. He used to live here. Lucas was standing at the coat rack, glancing toward him as if waiting for permission to speak. "Well?" Maigret gestured for him to come in. Lucas closed the door behind him. "I did some checking. The man from the canal, the one found in May, there was no formal autopsy. But the intern's notes suggested he hadn't eaten in several days. Malnourished, liver damage, alcoholism likely." Maigret nodded, unsurprised. "And we found the morgue record for the key. It matched an old storage locker at Gare de l'Est. Unclaimed. The lock was drilled last month, contents discarded. What was inside? A duffel, broken mirror, threadbare blanket, nothing useful." Maigret exhaled slowly. Was Claire listed as his emergency contact? No one was. He was never booked under a name. Then he left nothing except her memory. Lucas hesitated. "You think he was her father?" "I think he was the last person who made her feel seen." The silence between them settled like old smoke. Then Lucas asked, "Do we keep looking?" Maigret stared at the folder. She disappeared deliberately. But someone followed her. Not for the first time. The man in the scarf. Lucas's brow furrowed. "What's your theory?" "No theory. But he looked at her once through glass. She looked back. Not with fear. With fatigue." Maigret's voice dropped. "If he meant her harm, he wouldn't have waited. He's waiting for something. For her to give in, perhaps. Or for the right moment to step forward." Lucas crossed his arms, uneasy. What do we do? Maigret stood. We go back to the bookshop, not to ask questions, to watch. If she meant to vanish, she would have done it quietly. But if he's still watching her room, he'll return to B, the places she's touched. They arrived at Librairie du Lac just after 4. Rain drizzled against the awning. The window panes caught the light in soft, greasy smears. Inside, Monsieur Le Gall was arranging books with mechanical care, his mouth tight with weariness. Maigret gave a nod, but said nothing. He moved to a bench beneath the shop's narrow overhang. Lucas stood across the street, pretending to read a newspaper. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Customers came and went. A young couple argued about a travel guide. A dog trotted past, dragging a leash, its owner close behind. Then, toward 5 o'clock, a figure appeared at the corner. He did not approach the shop directly. He paused beside a lamp-post, pulled a pack of cigarettes from his coat, and lit one with a match. Red scarf, brown coat, hair slicked back against the damp, a stoop in his posture, not from age but from long practice at avoiding notice. He watched the bookshop through the smoke. His gaze didn't waver. Maigret did not move. The man didn't seem to notice him. The cigarette burned low. Then he crushed it underfoot, checked his watch, and walked on. Not quickly, but with the rhythm of someone used to lingering without purpose. Lucas gave a short nod across the street. Maigret followed at a distance. The man turned down Rue Daguerre, then Rue Boulard. He did not glance toward the pension, but his pace slowed as he passed it. At the corner, he lit another cigarette, waited a moment, then crossed and entered the narrow café 2 doors down. Maigret waited a full minute before going in after him. The café was warm, full of steam and the smell of chicory. The man sat at a corner table with his back to the wall, facing the window. He had ordered only a coffee. He sipped it slowly, gaze fixed on the fogged glass, though there was nothing to see. Maigret took a table near the door. He didn't speak. He only watched. The man's hands were red, like the bookseller had said. Not dirty, but raw, the way skin gets when you wash dishes in cold water too long. He touched the rim of the cup with 2 fingers, turning it slightly each time he swallowed. Not nervous. Controlled. After 10 minutes, Maigret stood and approached. Mind if I sit? The man looked up. His face was thin, the eyes deeply set, ringed with grey. Not surprised, not afraid. You're the police, he said. I am. The man gestured to the chair. Maigret sat. I've done nothing wrong. Maybe not. I haven't seen her. I know. A long silence followed. The man's eyes were tired. His mouth was dry. The steam from his coffee curled upward and vanished. You were watching the bookshop, Maigret said quietly. I was. You knew her. I still do. What was she to you? The man didn't answer right away. Then he said, You ever see someone disappear by degrees? Not suddenly. Just less each time? Maigret didn't reply. She used to sit in Parc Montsouris, on the bench near the pond, same coat, always alone. I never spoke to her. But you followed her. Number I watched. Once or twice. Then I stopped. Then the article. The man in the canal. He was your brother? Number just someone who loved her, who gave her something once, and couldn't keep it. I think she blamed herself for his dying. She kept the article. I know. Maigret looked at him. You waited for her to break. The man flinched barely. I waited for her to look back again. Why? The man's voice was small. Because I wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault. And now? I think she's somewhere quiet. Somewhere that doesn't ask questions. She didn't run. She folded herself up like a letter and slipped between cracks. The man's eyes glistened but didn't fall. Then maybe it's better I never find her. Maigret stood. He left a few francs on the table and nodded once. Outside, Lucas was waiting, hands in his coat. "Well?" Maigret lit his pipe. "He won't look again." Lucas frowned. "You believe him?" "I believe he's already said goodbye." They walked back through the wet streets as the light fell into evening. Somewhere in the city, Claire Vionnet had chosen absence over explanation, and no one, not the man, not the bookseller, not Maigret, would be able to call her back unless she wished it. And Maigret, pipe warming his hand, knew better than to chase what did not wish to be seen. The next morning, Maigret rose early, but lingered over his coffee longer than usual, the cup cooling between his palms as the faint hum of street sweepers passed under the windows of the apartment. Madame Maigret, sensing something had shifted, did not press him. She knew the rhythm of these cases, especially the ones that left no body, no arrest, no paperwork with bold stamps and signatures, the ones that faded quietly into the city's background, and yet stayed with him longer. At Quai des Orfèvres, the corridors smelled of wet wool and floor wax. Files changed hands. A courier left a parcel with Janvier. Lucas was talking to someone about a knife that had turned up in a basin. Life went on, but Maigret moved more slowly, as if walking through a story that no longer needed him. He returned to his desk and looked again at the thin file marked Claire Vionnet, Disparition. Inside, there was nothing new. No letter, no call, just the same list of fragments, her name, her room, the clipped article, the book with the pencil note, the pale photograph that revealed nothing more than restraint. It would soon be time to close the file. There was no evidence of a crime, no suspect, no indication of violence or coercion. Just absence, chosen, shaped, folded into the contours of a woman's life who had never truly belonged to any place. Still, Maigret could not quite bring himself to slide the folder into the archives. Instead, he left the office again and walked, coat open to the drizzle, past news kiosks and silent facades. He retraced her route from the pension to the bookshop, from the laundrette to the café, from the park bench near the pond where the man had once seen her sitting alone. He did not expect to find her, or the man, or any new clue. What he was looking for now was mood. Something in the rhythm of the spaces she had passed through, the trace of her footsteps in silence. The park was nearly empty. Rain misted across the gravel paths, clinging to the rusted railings and the broad leaves above the benches. He found the one near the pond easily, its paint chipped, the wood worn smooth at the centre from long quiet sits. He stood for a moment, not sitting, just letting his eyes scan the landscape she would have seen. Ducks gliding without hurry, joggers passing with headphones, a young woman hunched over a sketch pad. He could picture Claire here, small, still, wrapped in the same grey coat, eyes on the water, never moving too quickly, never trying to be noticed. He turned eventually and began walking toward Rue Vavin. Halfway there, he stopped at a tobacconist and bought a box of matches. The shopkeeper was humming an aria softly under his breath. Maigret paid, nodded, and stepped back into the wet light. Just ahead, across the street, he saw her. Not in the way that startled, not the shock of a criminal found or a fugitive cornered. Simply, a woman standing at a bookstore window. Not Librairie du Lac, but another, smaller, shabbier, on a side street near Montparnasse. The window was streaked with condensation, and the display was modest. A few used poetry collections, some postcards, a glass bowl filled with bookmarks. The woman was holding an umbrella low over her shoulder, tilted to keep the rain off her cheek. She was thinner than the photograph had suggested, her profile sharper. Her coat was not the same grey one, but something darker, longer, slightly too large for her frame. She looked older than 22, or perhaps it was only that the quiet around her had aged her. She stood still for a long time, not reading the titles, not glancing at her reflection, just staring into the glass. Then, gently, she turned and walked on. Maigret didn't follow. He lit his pipe, shielding the match with his palm, and leaned against the side of a kiosk. He watched her retreat, step by step, down the street toward the metro station. She did not hurry. She did not look back. When she disappeared down the stairs, he waited until the end of the match, then exhaled and walked slowly in the opposite direction. He returned to the office just past noon. Lucas looked up from his desk. "Anything?" Maigret shook his head. "You're going to close it?" "Soon." He sat, opened the folder again, and looked once more at the name written across the top. Then he wrote a short note on a scrap of paper and clipped it to the front. No indication of a foul play, disappearance likely voluntary, subject not a danger to herself or others, recommend administrative closure. He signed it slowly, then placed the folder on the corner of his desk, where it would wait for the morning run to records. But he didn't walk away yet. He poured himself a small glass of beer from the bottle Lucas kept in the back cabinet. Not much, just enough to wet his mouth and mark the end of a long silence. "She's not lost," he said aloud, though no one answered. That night, at dinner, Madame Maigret served him roast chicken and potatoes, as she often did on Wednesdays. She asked how his day had gone, and he told her, not everything, not the names or the places, but the mood of it, the heaviness that lifted, not with resolution, but with understanding. "She didn't want to be found," he said, "but she didn't want to vanish either." Madame Maigret nodded, understanding in the way wives often do when the mystery is no longer about guilt, but about sorrow. "Sometimes," she said, placing a spoon beside his plate, "you don't need to catch someone. You only need to let them go properly." He smiled faintly. In the middle of the night, Maigret woke to rain tapping against the window pane. He lay still, listening. Somewhere a pipe gurgled. A car passed. The wind changed directions, and he thought of Claire Vionnet, somewhere in the city, not hiding, not fleeing, just continuing. A girl who had carried a grief too quietly and left behind a world that had not learned to ask her the right questions. She was still walking, he knew, beneath a different name, in a different coat, slipping past the same benches and bookshops and cafes. Not escaping justice, escaping notice. He closed his eyes again and let her go. The rain lifted the next morning, as if in deference, a light haze lingering just above the rooftops. Paris had taken on that damp brightness peculiar to winter mornings, when the city seems pale but alert, its rhythms softened, its corners newly visible. Maigret rose at his usual time. He stood for a long while near the kitchen window, one hand on the warm ceramic of his coffee cup, watching the street below, where a man in a brown apron unloaded bread crates from a van. Madame Maigret set out a bowl of boiled eggs, then joined him quietly. "Are you going in?" she asked. Maigret nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure why. The file was ready. The note had been signed. By all accounts, the case was closed. No crime had been committed. No one had confessed or fled. No body had turned up. No blood. Only silence. And a girl who had passed like a shadow over the rain-washed glass of a bookshop window. Yet some thread remained in his fingers, taut and unresolved, pulling not toward resolution, but recognition. He stepped into the Quai des Orfèvres just after 9. The air inside still smelled faintly of wet coats and coal dust. Janvier passed him in the corridor, greeting him with a nod, but no words. Lucas was already at his desk, glancing through a report on stolen radios. The rhythm of the place felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves sensed something unfinished. Maigret moved to his office. The folder still sat where he had left it, the clipped newspaper tucked beneath the last page, the photograph face down. He picked it up and held it for a long time, then turned it over. Claire Vianney looked out from the page with that same restrained expression, not guarded exactly, but not open either. She had already learned, even then, how to vanish by degrees. He slid the folder into the administrative basket for closure. Then he sat back and lit his pipe. There was still one piece left unsettled. Not the girl. She had made her choice. But the man with the red scarf, the one who had watched from corners and windows, not out of threat, but out of grief, perhaps even devotion. Maigret had let him walk away, and rightly so. But there had been something in the man's last words that stayed with him. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault. He had said it quietly, like someone who had rehearsed the sentence in his mind for years, only to discover that the words, when finally spoken, had nowhere to land. At noon, Maigret left the office. He walked toward Montparnasse slowly, turning not toward the station, but toward a café on a side street, just behind the cemetery wall. The same café where he had last seen the man. Inside, the light was yellow and gentle. The windows steamed. The tables were half empty. He ordered coffee and sat in the same place near the door, watching the world move past in reflection. After 20 minutes, the door opened. It was not the man he expected. It was Monsieur Le Gall, the bookseller. His hair was damp, his coat patched at the elbow, and he looked thinner, older. He spotted Maigret at once and hesitated at the threshold, as if weighing whether to stay. Maigret gestured to the chair across from him. Le Gall sat. "I didn't follow you," he said quietly. "I saw you walking. You seemed unfinished." Maigret smiled faintly. "I am." The bookseller nodded. "I thought you might be." They sipped their coffees in silence. "She came by the shop," Le Gall said at last. "Yesterday, late afternoon. Didn't come in, just stood outside. I saw her through the shelf." Maigret looked at him. "Did she see you?" "I don't know. She didn't come in." "Did she look well?" "She looked thinner, but not broken." Maigret said nothing. The bookseller cleared his throat. There was something else. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, unmarked, creased at the corners. He handed it across the table. "She left this. Slipped it through the door. I didn't open it." Maigret turned the envelope in his hands. There was no name, no address. He opened it carefully. Inside was a short note, written in small, neat script. "Please stop looking for me. He needed me to watch him vanish. I did. That was all I had left to give. I am not lost, just choosing silence. I hope you understand." It was unsigned. Maigret read it twice, then folded it slowly, deliberately, and slipped it into his coat. He looked across at Le Gall. "She trusted you." The man's eyes were heavy. "I never gave her reason to, but maybe that's why." Maigret stood. He left some francs on the table, nodded once, and stepped back into the street. He walked without direction for a time. The weather had softened again. The sky above Paris was the color of pewter, but the wind was gentle. He moved past the streets she had known, Rue Daguerre, the laundry, the pension, not to revisit, but to release. Every place now felt empty of her, as if she had drawn back even her memory. At the edge of Montsouris, he sat briefly on the same bench where she had once watched the ducks. A pair of students walked past, laughing quietly. The pond rippled under a mild gust. Somewhere, a dog barked once and was gone. Maigret finished his pipe, rose, and began the slow walk back toward the center of the city. In his coat was a letter that did not explain, did not confess, did not apologize. But it revealed more than most full testimonies, the kind of truth that existed between people who could never quite speak it aloud. At the quay, he returned to his office. The folder had already been removed. The desk was bare. He pulled out a new sheet of paper and began to write a final note for the internal record. Not for evidence, not for conclusion, but for memory. Subject made a conscious decision to disappear without subterfuge. No indication of external pressure or danger. Emotional withdrawal observed through indirect witnesses. Closure advised not for procedural reasons, but out of respect for choice. Some absences must remain undisturbed. He signed it with a quiet flourish. Then he sat back and let the silence return. Somewhere, in a different arrondissement, a woman named Claire, or perhaps something else now, might be reading a book, or folding laundry, or standing in the back of a new cafe waiting for the next cup to pour. She would not be hiding. She would simply be elsewhere. And Maigret, leaning back in his chair as the evening deepened across the Seine, knew he would never look for her again. But he would remember her, not as a mystery, not as a file, but as a question that had once sat across from him in silence and taught him something quiet about the weight of vanishing. It was late afternoon when Maigret stood again at the window of his office, looking down at the quiet flow of the Seine, the water dark and slow beneath the Pont Saint-Michel. The sky was mottled with dimming light, and the hush of early winter was setting in, wrapping the city in that subtle way Paris had of softening even its coldest corners. The file was gone from his desk now, sent off, with the rest of the morning dispatch, and yet he hadn't truly left the case. Not because there was anything left to solve, but because it had settled into him, the way some silences do, more enduring than noise. The letter she had written, unsigned, direct, tender in its restraint, sat now in the drawer to his left, folded once, as though still carrying the shape of the hand that placed it through the bookshop door. She had asked not to be followed, not to be found. But more than that, she had made it clear that what needed to be done had already been done. She had kept vigil over someone fading. She had done what no one else had wanted to do. And then, with that final gesture, she had stepped out of the room quietly, without demand, without sorrow, as if she had always intended to vanish after the last page turned. It was the kind of disappearance Maigret had seen only a handful of times in his long years, not born of panic, not veiled in deceit, but shaped carefully, deliberately, like someone folding into a life they had chosen long before anyone realized it. That she had written the note at all told Maigret everything he needed to know. She had not wanted to be misunderstood. She had not wanted to be mourned. Still, there was a residue of her that lingered. In the street corners she had paused at, in the shop windows where her breath might once have left a mark, in the man who had watched her without approaching, carrying a quiet love or guilt, it didn't matter which, in the bookseller who had respected her silence without knowing why. Each of them had seen only a fraction of her, and yet all of them had sensed what she carried. Maigret moved slowly through the station corridors, nodding to Lucas, who was finishing a telephone call, and passing Janvier without speaking. He didn't go to the records room or the briefing hall. Instead, he stepped out into the evening, the city cooling fast under the encroaching dark. His breath met the air in brief, soft clouds. He found himself walking once more toward the Montparnasse quarter, not for duty now, but for the lingering shape of the case that hadn't quite left his coat. The streets had thinned of commuters. Lights began to glow behind cafe windows, and the metallic clink of cutlery floated out across the sidewalks. At the corner near the cemetery wall, he paused again at the small bookshop. Inside, Monsieur Le Gall was closing for the night. He looked up, caught Maigret's eye through the pane, and nodded once. There was no need to speak. The letter had said everything, and Le Gall, Maigret knew, would keep her memory like a bookmark pressed between pages, not reopened, not forgotten. From there, Maigret walked the side streets, letting the city's rhythm guide him. He passed the cafe where the man with the red scarf had once watched the window in silence. The table was empty now. The street beyond it faded into darkness. Eventually, he turned north toward Parker, Montsouris. The gates were open still, the last of the evening strollers slipping out. He entered slowly. The gravel was wet, but firm. The pond reflected the pale bruising of the sky. He stood beside the bench where she used to sit, just long enough to notice that the paint had begun to peel more along the sides. Then he sat, breathing in the smell of damp leaves and wet stone. This was not where it had ended, he knew. Not for her. For her, it had ended long before she'd stopped writing letters to the cousin in Limoges, before she'd left the coat behind at the laundrette, before the man from the canal had vanished below the surface, like a name unspoken too long. It had ended when she understood she was the last witness to someone else's unraveling, and that the world, as always, would not ask her what she had seen. He thought of the last time he'd seen her, just a profile, just a woman at a bookstore window. But in that brief stillness, he had felt the entire arc of the story, from quiet daughter to absent worker, from loyal witness to soft, invisible vanisher. She had not run. She had dissolved. A breeze stirred across the surface of the pond. Somewhere behind him, a boy whistled out of tune. A newspaper lifted from a bench and skated along the path, before catching on a hedge. Maigret stood and began the walk back out of the park. Back home, Madame Maigret was preparing a small supper. The scent of lentils and garlic filled the kitchen. She looked up as he entered. "You've closed it?" she asked. "Yes." "And?" She didn't want justice, just peace. Madame Maigret nodded, as if she'd known all along. They ate in near silence, the kind that was neither tense nor weary, but companionable. When Maigret finished, he lit his pipe and watched the smoke curl up toward the ceiling. "She was very young," he said. Madame Maigret poured tea. "And very old, I think." He said nothing more that night. The file would not be reopened. The girl would not be found, not unless she wanted to be. And Maigret, who had spent his life searching, who had pulled confessions from hardened men and quiet women alike, understood finally that this was not a matter of finding. It was a matter of release. In his drawer, beneath an unused folder, he kept the note. Not in the archives, not with the evidence. Just a simple scrap of paper, folded once, a reminder that some stories did not end in arrests or trials. Some ended only when you stopped chasing them and sat still long enough to let them pass you by. Outside, the rain began again, a soft, steady tapping against the glass, and Maigret, eyes closed now, listened. Not for footsteps, not for phone calls, just for the quiet echo of a girl who had chosen her silence and had asked very gently to be allowed to keep it. The following week passed without mention of Claire Vionnet. The file remained closed, archived quietly among the many whose endings were written not in ink, but in understanding. Maigret did not revisit the pension, nor the bookshop, nor the café near the cemetery. He did not walk past the park bench, though he thought of it often, not because he doubted her fate, but because he understood it now as a kind of answer, the kind that asks not to be spoken. It was on a quiet Thursday morning, grey and unmoving, that the final thread reached him, not in the form of a clue, but a visitor. The knock was soft. Lucas had just left for the prefecture, and the office was near empty. Maigret opened the door himself. The man who entered was not unexpected, though Maigret had not thought to see him again. The red scarf was gone, replaced by a plain collar. The coat was the same, heavy and worn. His hands were still red at the knuckles. He sat without waiting to be asked. "I heard," he said. Maigret didn't ask how. The man pulled something from his pocket. It was not a photograph. It was a page, torn from a small diary or pocketbook, folded 3 times, slightly yellowed. He set it on the desk between them. Maigret opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable, small, measured, sparse in words. I do not hate him. I only cannot carry him with me any more. I have nothing left that is mine, and so I must go before I forget how to leave. There was no name, no date, but it had been hers, and the man had kept it. I never meant to frighten her, he said, voice low. I never spoke because I knew I wouldn't know what to say. She knew you watched, he nodded. She forgave you, Maigret added quietly. The man swallowed. I think I was the last one who saw her before she left. She came to the canal. Before the man died. She asked me not to look for her again, and you didn't. Number until I saw her at the bookshop, and I thought, maybe. She left you a kindness, Maigret said. You tried to return it, that's all. The man stood slowly. He did not shake hands. He only said, Thank you for not finding her. When the door clicked shut behind him, Maigret remained seated for a long time. There would be no arrest, no funeral, no confession. Only the quiet exchange of memory between two people who had loved her in silence, each in their own way. Later that afternoon, as the sun pierced through a crack in the clouds and painted the city in faint, tired gold, Maigret stepped outside. He walked to the river, where the current moved without urgency, carrying the remnants of a long rain. He leaned against the stone railing and lit his pipe. He thought not of suspects or guilt, but of the quiet dignity with which some people disappeared, not to escape justice, but to reclaim their peace. Claire Vionnet had not vanished. She had receded, gently, like a tide, from a world that never quite asked her to stay. And Maigret, who had once thought his task was to uncover every truth, now understood the weight of letting one pass unspoken. He finished his pipe, turned toward the quay, and walked home, leaving behind nothing more than smoke dissolving into the winter air, 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 dissolving into the winter air.